Welcome to Maintaining Legacy, also known as AngularJS Less Painful. Let's jump right into what the legacy of AngularJS is. It was released initially in 2010. From there, it earned its place largely in the enterprise space. While Angular is here, and wonderful, I highly recommend it, AngularJS didn't just vanish and go away overnight. Many corporate environments still use AngularJS applications, and that means there are developers who need to maintain them. Spoilers, I'm one of those developers. When trying to find some usage on AngularJS and some data for that, I looked at built with trends, which tells me there's over 800K total live sites. But more importantly there, if you look at it, it says there are 2K in the top 10K sites for whatever their data is worth. Now, who am I to talk to you about AngularJS? Well, my name is Niedzwiecki. I am your friendly neighborhood kilted coder. You can find me on Twitter as @kiltedcode and GitHub as well. You'll generally know me because I like to rock a kilt, hence where the name comes from. I always wear them up on stage, and I still am, even while I'm speaking to you here, even though it's virtual, but you're going to have to trust me on that one. So I am a geeky dad, and I'm raising two geeky children. I love to play Pathfinder in my spare time, which is tabletop RPG. I love to cook. I enjoy the Disney parks. I have since I was little, and I'm a big kid inside, so it works that way. You'll also find me wearing my kilt in the park, so if you're ever in Walt Disney World, look out for it. I also really enjoy to play video games when I have the chance. So I am a senior software engineer at Disney Streaming Services. Yes, I did just use this as an excuse to play this animation because I really, really like it. So what do I do? Well, with Disney Streaming Services, I help build software to support the media processing for Disney Plus and ESPN Plus. My team specifically provides insight and view into this process and is a UI into that, so that UI happens to be built with AngularJS. So I've done a lot of Angular over the years. I originally did AngularJS in the 1X versions when it was the new versions then, and saw the oncoming of components and things like that. From there, I did move on to Angular 2 when it came out, and on through the newer versions from there. And now I've come full circle, and I'm back to working on AngularJS again. That's what this talk comes from. It really is part of driven by my lessons learned my second time around on AngularJS, and kind of what my team has done to try to make that world better for us. So, where do we really start? Well, the style guide is end of the chat. A style guide kind of provides you your basis for how your code should look. It gives you your syntax, your conventions, your structures, everything you're going to need. The standard the first time around when I was working on AngularJS was the John Papa's guide. I loved it. It was perfect. It had everything I needed. Just like Angular, the guides have moved on. It doesn't cover everything you need to work with AngularJS now. It doesn't cover components and not using controllers separately and some other pieces there. So you're going to have to look at other sources. Another great source is Todd Motto's AngularJS style guide. Now, when he updated his last, it was built towards a path towards Angular 2 release. So he uses ES2015 for things like imports and exports and classes, which are great. But it's a larger departure from what you might be used to seeing in AngularJS. But it's also great because it sets you up for the newer versions of Angular, because that's how those codes is going to be written. So what you really want to do is look through these and figure out what are the parts that you want. If you're part of a team, that might mean sitting down and having discussions on these to agree upon up front. But it's all about taking from these different guides and other sources, and even from just your own personal preferences of how you guys like to do things, and making that be your basis for how you want to work. Now we're going to look at some of the things from these style guides. So some of them are older, some of them are newer things, and just talk about some of those things you might want to make sure you're doing within your team. First is single responsibility. This is a simple one. Essentially, it just means one component, one file. It doesn't mean just components by the name, but services. You shouldn't have one file of a whole bunch of services. You should have one service in one file and let your build system do everything else to bring everything together. And additionally, you want to keep it simple. So kind of a rule of thumb is how many lines of code you should use in your file and how many should be in functions. So the one from John Papa's is 400 lines of code per file, 75 lines of code for functions. The idea is this gives you a sign that things should be broken down some. Key example of that is we have some components that are larger than 400 lines of code. Even when we take out the fact that it's an inline template, the JavaScript is over 400 lines. It's too much code that really means a sign to us that we should break this down. It's also a sign that, hey, not everybody's perfect. But the idea is here is it helps you let you know when you have too much going on here that you should have extracting code to either other services, other components, whatever you need, but it's telling you that this is getting pretty complicated and you might want to look at it further. Next thing we're going to look at is dropping scope. So early Angular, that was how you accessed everything was through $scope. You shouldn't do that anymore. And while we're talking about that, also get rid of using $root scope. Just shouldn't use it. Yes, there are some exceptions. There are some things in AngularJS that you can't access in any other way than using root scope or scope, but you shouldn't use root scope to pass things between your components. You shouldn't use scope to do some other things like that. You should be using your proper variables and methods when you can, and using only these for the certain things that you can only access in the AngularJS way this way. As we're talking about that, you also don't really need to use var vm equals this anymore, which is a very common pattern you might have seen, but you don't really need that anymore for components. So components are your template, your control, and your bindings all bundled up into one. They really should be your default for UI pieces and moving forward, and they will aid you in moving to Angular because that's the base building block for Angular when you're talking in the UI. But anywhere in the web, that's what you're going to talk about. You have web components, you have components in React, you have all these other things that use components. It's a very common idea for how to bundle up this UI logic together and how to group it. In AngularJS, this will give you controller as by default, which is something you'll see across the style guides of using controller as for your controllers. So you get it by default here, and you can use $control in your templates and not have to do anything. It also sets you up to being able to do one-way data flow. What is that, you say? Yes, get out of using two-way bindings. Just don't do it. Your inputs that get passed in should use the less than or the at symbol, not the equal sign. This has been available since 1.5 with components, so if you're before 1.5, one of your first things probably should be upgrading your version of AngularJS. Now, in fact, you can use less than and ampersands for callbacks. I like to use ampersands just for the sake of stylistically, it tells me that this is going to be used as a callback and as a function more than just also the name, but you can name them that way as well to keep them straight. And when we're talking one-way bindings, that allows you to refactor components that are dependent on just inputs into small stateless components. This is a great idea to make really usable components. If you have a component where there's nothing mutating data inside the component, everything comes from outside, and the same set of inputs will always make the same template design in the end, no matter how much logic is in the middle, and you don't need outside services, you can create a component that's very usable and is stateless in that it doesn't have to maintain anything in there, the same inputs or the same outputs. This sets you up for Angular components where you can use the on-push change detection strategy, which says, hey, if I need to redraw, if you're in AngularJS and you're talking about the digest cycle, you know really well about the digest cycle. You will learn it quickly in AngularJS. But when you're digesting, when you're looking at do things need to be redrawn and your parent component has to redraw itself, when you get to the child component, in Angular that on-push will say, hey, the inputs haven't changed, you don't need to redraw them and use the same HTML you used before. Now, if you're doing things with inputs and one-way bindings here, at least in AngularJS, it will be quicker and it'll be more performant that way. But it's setting you up for the future. It's all we're always looking towards the future. Next thing we'll look at with components are lifecycle hooks. So these are basically all about the life cycle of the component. It's part of that component lifestyle. And all of these have parallels in Angular. So we're going to look at first is $oninit, and in Angular there is an oninit method as well to call with components that you can implement. This basically is fired when the component is ready to go, and it will initialize the component, and it's basically meant to initialize the code for the component, for that controller of the component. Now, as it gets called here, you can see in our example here, we're binding a Jedi in, we have a council service, which we're injecting here, and then we're going to go ahead and set up a list to a default value, to the empty value initially, and then we're going to go ahead and initialize the service, tell it to get itself set up. Not all this code you would exactly do this way, but this is just an example of, hey, this is stuff that when this component boots up, this is how we need to initialize so that we can move forward from here. It's sort of like a constructor in that it's that initialization code, but it's not a quote constructor. Constructor is a dangerous word to use because it has a lot of meanings and there aren't actual constructors when you're talking about classes in JavaScript, so we don't really want to go there. But it's your initialization of your controller. The next one is postlink. Now this one's a little harder. If you worked a lot in directives, it essentially is the postlink function from directives. It is the hook for when child elements are linked and ready to go. So if you're doing something where you need to know that all the child elements are ready, and then you want to do something, generally this postlink is because you have to do some sort of weird DOM manipulation. This is work for this. I don't really have a great example for this. I can kind of show you here how it works, and the idea of this postlink function is something that requires children, any of that code you can set here. I don't really have a good example for it because I don't have really a use case where I ever use this one. But it is there if you do need to do the postlink here. I feel like since we're talking with a binding of a Jedi, I feel like there's a youngling joke here talking about children. I feel like it's been made there, but I'm just going to let this one slide. I'm going to let it go. Now, next lifecycle hook is on changes. To me, this is arguably the most important. This is at the center of your one-way data flow. And this fires when an input changes. It also gives you access to those changes, so we can see what has changed in this object and calculate anything we need to do with that. We can know the old and the new all through this function. It also happens to fire at runtime, but you can filter that call out with isFirstChange. The reason why it has to fire at runtime is because, hey, if you want to bind on something, it has to actually be initialized. So onChange kind of allows that to happen. So you can filter that out. So on example here, we look at the changes for the Jedi, and if it is first change, we return. Otherwise, we look at changes to Jedi. If that exists, we can then calculate the history of the Jedi and set it to that training history list that we initialized in the onInit. It's great for treating your inputs as immutable, so you can copy these objects if you need to using Angular copy. You can do other stuff with that. But in the changes, you can also look at multiple inputs. So we only have one input here, but you have changes.Jedi. You will have this for all of your inputs. So if you have multiple inputs, you can have logic here to say, if this input changes, do this. If this one changes, do that instead, and only have to recalculate what you actually need to do. So this is great at the heart of your one-way binding. And so you can get things wrong in here, but this is great. The best thing about this, that an easy refactor for your code is if you're doing stuff where you have an input that's a list and you have to do something else to change that list, or you need to set up a list. onChanges helps you avoid a lot of those headaches of the digest iteration loop error that you get all the time in AngularJS. The last one we're going to talk about is onDestroy. Now, the name tells it all. It fires when the component is being torn down and needs to be destroyed. So it's great for any sort of cleanup you need to do, especially if you do post-link. You can do some cleanup there if you have listeners, things like that. I really feel like onDestroy and Jedi, there's another youngling joke to be made here, but I feel like that might not be in good taste. So we're gonna move on from that one too. Next one is ES2015 Style. So as I mentioned, Todd Motto's guide has a bit about this. And so I wanted to show you a little bit about what this would look like. So this is centered on ES6, ES2015, whatever you want to call it. It shifts to using imports and exports. So it's moving towards an Angular pattern. So I wanted to show you what that would look like for some of your code here. So you can see you're inputting Angular, you're inputting your component. And then you're going to export that for the module. And then in the actual component, again, you can import your template to have that in there. And you can have then you have your bindings, and you have your template, and you have your controller, and your controller is a class. And then you have the constructor to do your injection. And then you have your onInit. So everything is there just like you would have. But it's wrapped slightly differently. But this is that pattern. It's very similar to if you look up examples of Angular. This is going to be very similar in the style of what it looks like. And so it's kind of shifting you towards that. But if you want to use these patterns, you want to use imports, which has a lot of its own benefits. This is kind of what it would look like. And Todd Motto's guide is a great set of examples for that. Now, tackling code. So this is the next problem that we need to do. Once we know what we want to do, we need to tackle our code. So let's get down to business to assess your code. Sorry, I work for Disney. I feel like I just need to sing at some point and just break out in a song. So we need to identify a problem child. So you need to pick what is that problem you want to tackle first. It could be something you pulled from the style guide that you feel is your largest problem that you need to get matching on. It could be just something that speaks most to you and that you love the way that looks and feels, so you want to get that way. Or maybe it's something that will help your performance. So do you want to get rid of scope? Do you need to move to .component and not using .controller? Or do you have that but you're not really using Lifecycle Hooks? Do you want to put Lifecycle Hooks in there? Do you really want to make that jump into ES6, ES2015 and using imports? Whatever those that you want to do, kind of sit down and kind of list out what are the things that are most important to you that you need to do, and kind of figure out what is the first one you want to tackle. From there, you want to make an example. So we want to convert something, say, and we want to make it to this new standard. So what is that standard? You can point to things in the style guides, but it's also really useful just to have your own example. This is what it's going to look like. So when anyone is touching your codebase, you can go, hey, this is how we want to do it. So if you're going to make a component, this is what it should look like. Go look at this file. This is one that we converted over. Now, not everything is a one-to-one, so you may need several. So especially if you're looking at components, you might need an example of here's how a routed component works with service calls, and here's how the component that is a small stateless component with just inputs, and what these two should look like. Now you'll have When you do this, you can also create your own generators for your new components and services. In this example, you can say, hey, I just want to generate this, and you can create your own extension in VS Code, your own generator in WebStorm. However you want to do it, you can make it up to make your job even easier for net new things. But you want to do that. So what I want to go with and show you here is an example of something that we did in our code. So this is based off of actual code that when I started the company, what it looked like and what it looks like, what we moved towards. So this idea is there's a component. And so we were already using .component. So kind of goes on our curtain here. We were using Babel, so you'll see arrow functions in here. We were using .component, but we had the IFI wrapping around our whole file. So we moved that and pulled that out to be a part of our build process now. So you don't see that in the after part here. Next, we dropped the use of VM. We didn't use it anymore. We just referenced this directly. You can see we started using onInit. So we had this function, this user service.verify authentication, that was just firing off in our component. Not really the way to do that. That's something that's meant when you are ready to go to initialize it. So that is inside the onInit function. When we need to use something only in the template, it's const. Otherwise, we'll use it. Or sorry, if we're using something that's in the template, we'll use this. Otherwise, we use const. So if it's not something you need to reference in the actual HTML, we shouldn't be using this dot. It should be const, so it's kind of internal to the controller itself. We also have a kind of example of what we consider private variables, naming with an underscore, kind of idea of like showing the intention that this is meant to be internal variable and not directly referenced in the template. And just not using this, but kind of showing that idea here. It kind of comes from some other languages more so than in JavaScript here. Now, again, not perfect. So as I was prepping for this talk, I said, self, this verify auth, we should really, in Angular, this will be great because we can put this in a route guard. I love route guards. It'll be perfect for that. And then I went, wait, self? I could do that in AngularJS too. I can do that right now, actually. And I went, ooh, that does need root scope, though, but it's worth it for this. So this would be better is that verify auth gets moved from the onInit out into a route change start. That is looking at when routes change, then it would verify authentication. So this component won't even load if you're not authenticated. And then when onInit here just does the actual code that it needs to actually execute here. After the stuff that was this onUserVerified function before is now inside our onInit method. And that's when it actually initializes. That's what it's supposed to be. So, this is proof that you can take steps to be better and not have to worry about being perfect. We took steps to be better, but honestly, this is an even better way we could do than what we were doing, even in just AngularJS. So, there's always room to improve, and that's what you should be looking at. You should be looking at not how do I move everything, because you're not going to change everything at one time. Change it forward, move forward, make small changes into it. Now, once you have an example, the way I like to say is if you touch it, upgrade it. A very common way of saying, if we said this is how we're going to do a component, from then on, anytime you touch a component, it should be a refactor into that style. Now, if you're doing something like ES2015 and the imports, you're going to have to do that across the board. But if you're just saying, hey, we're going to change all VM VM equals this into just this dot, you could do that across the board for controllers and services and everything. And just say, when you touch it, you should refactor that. For us, it was, hey, this is how we're doing a component, so the controller should be inline. It shouldn't be a separate function call. It should be the order in which things are presented of bindings in template and controller. We should have the bindings there. We should not be using scope. We should be using $controller. Our controller, when we initialize the injects, we actually put them all on new lines. Those are little things that we decide just for ourselves. That's how we want to do it. So when you touch it, that should be a part of that PR. And the expected is when you give a new PR in any code, it should be in the new standard. And it's very common that, especially early on, that the PR would say, hey, make this follow the standard. Or, hey, make these on new lines, that's the way we do it. Hey, remove the VM equals this, and change those, because that's not how we want to do things moving forward. And it's great. So when you do this, you can update everything and move it forward. And organically, you will start changing things. Now, at times, you're not going to organically touch everything for new features or bug fixes. So that means at times, you're going to have to schedule time to go and touch the other stuff you haven't, to pull it all forward into your new standard, to be able to move forward and get that debt out of the way. And while we're talking about debt, when you're in there, also check and update your tests. It's important to do. Make sure you're considering them. So next, we're going to talk about building. So I mentioned a little bit about some things that we did for their build. So basically, if there's something you want to always do, you can consider about automating it. So first and foremost is Babel. Very common in your world in JavaScript to use Babel. It's a toolchain, converts ECMAScript 2015, backwards compatible JavaScript. So very easy one. If you're working in the field of JS, you probably have heard of this. You may not have, and that's great. It's fine if you don't, but it's basically a way to let you write the new JS and have it compile down to old JS so that it will still run on old browsers if that's what you need to support. The next one is ng-annotate. So this is basically made to add and remove AngularJS dependency injection annotation. So instead of having to have a controller where you have it pass in an array of everything that you're going to do there, which is one of the things in our example, you pull that out, ng-annotate will now input that for you. So you need this for code minification and injection to make sure things go right, but you put that in there and ng-annotate will just add it for you. Now the latest version is Babel plugin AngularJS annotate, which I listed here, mainly just because it is a fork of the original ng-annotate, which is not maintained anymore. But this is the version that you need if you want to go that import style, because to do that ng-inject that we saw in our ES2015 example, you need to be using the Babel plugin AngularJS annotate version, because that's the only one that will actually support for that for you. Another one that we used was the IFI, so immediately invoked function expressions. Standard that you should wrap your files in those, but instead of having to do that in every single one, we just run that as part of our script with gulp to go ahead and just add those to all our files there and then concatenate them together. It's great, it's easy, saves you the step there, saves you having to write that code. Now, if you're doing the import style, that's not important. You don't actually need to do that. But if you're not, if you're doing the classical way of AngularJS, it's something you'll need. Now, I know I was talking to myself, but now I know you're saying to yourself, self, I want more. So if you want more, where do we go from here? So we talked about moving forward our AngularJS, but after AngularJS, what is more? More is Angular. So you want to move to Angular. The important part here is to make a plan. Figure out what you want, what you need, and how to get there. Just like I talked about before, you still need a plan. It's another plan. It's a plan of plans. So to upgrade to Angular, you have two real routes to go. The main route is going using, three routes. Three routes is just rewrite the whole thing. Not usually practical, or if it was, you probably would have already done that. So the first route is ng upgrade, which allows you to do hybrid apps. That's kind of the easiest, the most straightforward path forward, in that it is going to take what you have now and make it Angular. The other option is you can always run things side by side. It has its own drawbacks there. It has some positives, it has its own drawbacks, but you can run an Angular app and an AngularJS app and just set your routing to go accordingly. One thing you're going to need to consider when you're looking at this, and not just what do I need to do for my code to get it to move forward, is consider what library usage you're using. So if you're using something like Bootstrap, and you're using UI Bootstrap in AngularJS, that's going to use your 3x CSS. That's what it was maintained to. That's all the further it went. But if you're using ng Bootstrap for Angular, that means you're going to need to use the 4x CSS. And there are changes. There's a reason why I went from 3 to 4. Some of those changes could break or cause problems with your UI logic itself. So just because you're thinking, oh, I got to change all of my JavaScript code to change so I can upgrade with ng upgrade, but if I'm going to pull that forward, that means I'm going to need to upgrade my third-party stuff that I'm using, which means my CSS change, which suddenly means now my actual templates don't work right. So you want to make sure you're considering all of the pieces of the puzzle when you're figuring out your strategy to move forward, and when you're figuring out how much effort that's going to take. So ng upgrade allows you to run a hybrid AngularJS and Angular app together. So it allows you basically to upgrade AngularJS stuff to be run in Angular, or downgrade Angular stuff to be run in AngularJS. It does require some lifting to get your AngularJS ready to go just to be a hybrid app. Most commonly is moving it to TypeScript and moving to the import style. There are some things I read out there about doing it without having to do that, but I personally don't know that. I'm not an expert in this field. One thing you can do to assess your code base is an ng migration assistant that you can use. It's a command line to run against your tool built by someone at Google, and it will assess your code to say, here's what you need to do. Here's all your problem spots to be able to basically use ng upgrade and what work you're going to need to do. And I'll tell you things like, if you're using a controller, you can't do that anymore. You got to use a component. And I'll tell you a lot of processes that you're going to have to use TypeScript instead of JavaScript and move that things forward. As I said, I'm not an expert in this field, but there's plenty of help out there. One of the strongest help I can point you to is Sam Julien. He did this work, and he got so good in figuring it out and had to work through it, and he went the hybrid app approach. So he got so good at it that he made his own course on it, upgrading AngularJS.com. So, he is an expert in the field that if you need to talk to someone about, he's a perfect person to go reach out to, and he has courses there to help you through it. The idea is once you get a hybrid app set up and running, then you build everything new in Angular, and then just like the components, if you touch it, upgrade it to Angular, and you move things slowly, organically. So the nice thing is once you put the work in to get it running as a hybrid app, then you can move it forward the same way we talk about moving forward within AngularJS. But you have to put in your prep work for that. The other option I threw out there was running side by side. Now this is not great, but it can be done. So you can give Angular its own subdirectory and run off of that and have the server load the appropriate index file and then let the routing take over there. But that means everything in your Angular app will be under its own subdirectory. So it means if you're moving things, you'll be changing routes. You have to update your build to handle both building at once. It can be good for net new stuff or for learning Angular. Moving and testing, moving stuff forward there. A great thing is you could use it if you need to kind of show what it would be. And here's the greatness of it. Hey, I'm going to stand this up. It's side by side. Look at what I can do here. Look at how small it builds the code to. Look at how small the code base is to do the same piece that I did over here. And look at what this will look like. And kind of, if you need a little extra help to sell it, it can work for that. It can work for if you just have a separate part of your app and you want to develop this here side by side, and they can be separate. Problems is it doesn't share state in the front end. So everything has to come from the back end if you need to share things there. It also means when you move from the AngularJS to the Angular app, you're going to have to boot the Angular app. And if you go back to AngularJS, you're going to have to bootstrap that app again. So that back and forth would cause extra loads in between. So it definitely has a lot of drawbacks, but it could work in the right situation depending on what you need. Why are these so important? Well, long-term support is why these are important. AngularJS was planned to be given a 3-year long-term support. But the LTS of this was extended due to COVID-19 until December 31st, 2021. But after the end of 2021, that means there will be no more bug fixes. It won't be officially supported anymore. Now, it doesn't mean it won't cease to function, but it means you won't get any more fixes for it. It won't be handled anymore. And that is usually something that is a really good go-getter to say, hey, this is why we need to upgrade. You need justification of money and developer hours and time and all that of why to justify the extra time you need to move it forward. But a really easy one is, well, the support's going away. That's why we need to go forward. Business people understand that a lot. So really the question is, where do we go from here? Figure out what you want, make a plan, and take the steps to get there. This is the way forward. So what I want to do is actually want to leave you with the theme of what I feel is an underrated Disney movie, Meet the Robinsons. And the theme of that movie was keep moving forward. So I've mentioned it a couple times throughout here. You might have picked up on it. But it's really rooted in a quote from Walt Disney. It says, around here, however, we don't look backwards for very long. We keep moving forward, opening new doors and doing new things because we're curious. And curiosity keeps leading us down new paths. I think it's a great quote for what we're talking about here. And honestly, how I feel about as a developer is I'm always trying to move forward and I'm always curious and trying new things and opening those doors. And that's what you need to do here. So the process isn't always easy in moving AngularJS forward. And old code isn't always fun. But if you move it forward, it can have a lot more value and feel a lot more rewarding when you're doing that. And if you're moving forward, eventually you'll get to where you want to be. So you don't have to go far. There'll be failures, but each step forward is a step in the direction you want to be. Thank you.